Alright, so for our next section of the community ecology and ecosystem ecology, and as you can tell by now, this chapter is fairly long, we're going to be looking at food webs and nutrient cycles and how they pertain to the ecosystem. So we're going to take a kind of a quick broad overview look at these two different kind of sets of problems, energy versus nutrient pathways in the chapter. And one of the key differences between energy and nutrients is that energy is like a one-way trip through the ecosystem, whereas nutrients can be recycled. There is something in physics and chemistry called the first law of thermodynamics, which says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. And there's a second law that says energy will always be converted to a less useful form every time we convert it. So if we convert energy from sun to plant to herbivore to carnivore, each step that we do that, there's going to be a conversion of energy into the form of heat, which is not a very usable energy source. So that means there's always has to be energy coming in. Every time we convert energy from one form to another, some of it gets put off as heat. So energy is a one-way trip. You always have to have energy coming in if we're going to continue to fuel the ecosystem. Nutrients, on the other hand, tend to stay kind of in place. So if something dies, if a plant dies, if a zebra dies, if something dies, it gets recycled, it gets decomposed, it gets broken down, and those nutrients then go back into the bodies of other things in the ecosystem. Energy doesn't work that way. Energy is always being given off as heat, so it's a one-way trip, whereas nutrients tend to be recycled within the system. For probably maybe 95% or so of the life on the planet, you and me included, the energy that we need to run not only ourselves, but the energy that runs plants and all the other animals and fungi and protists and a lot of bacteria comes from the sun. And so the initial step is to, of course, convert sunlight into carbohydrate in the form of glucose typically, and that's done obviously by plants doing photosynthesis. And then from there it can be converted into the bodies of other organisms. So eventually the energy that comes in from the sun, even though it's a high quality energy source, eventually all of the energy will take on the form of heat due to our friendly second law of thermodynamics. So nutrients, like I said, are recycled. If we take things like sulfur, if we take things like carbon or phosphorus, those things tend to be cycled within the ecosystem, and occasionally some of those things will be sort of temporarily lost. They're sort of unavailable for a while. Sulfur and phosphorus in particular have a really long lifespan before they tend to get back into the body of a living thing, but eventually they do get back into the bodies of living things. So it goes from perhaps a terrestrial ecosystem into an aquatic ecosystem, maybe eventually into the ocean where it gets buried in the sediments, and from there that individual atom of carbon or sulfur or phosphorus could be locked up maybe for centuries or millennia before it eventually finds its way into the body of another living organism. So even though nutrient cycles can be long, there is this continual conversion back from living to non-living form of those materials. And again, they don't leave the planet. The nutrients stay on the planet, whereas energy technically gets radiated back out into space again. It comes in via sunlight, gets picked up by living things for a while, and then eventually all the energy is given off again in the form of heat. So we're going to take a look at energy first and focus on that, and then we're going to go into nutrient cycles. We're actually not going to cover the acid rain and global warming part in this chapter. That will be part of the next chapter. That's a mistake on my part. So these last two bullet points will not be in this chapter. They'll be in chapter 20, which is the final chapter in the course. So energy coming in from the sun is carried as electromagnetic waves coming in form of sunlight. Most of the energy is either absorbed or reflected. It's actually not absorbed by plants. And in fact, plants don't even use all the energy. They only absorb roughly the same wavelengths of light that you and I can see with our eyes. Is, for the most part, most of that light is what plants also use. The rest of it is not really a factor for them at all. And so of the complete total amount of sunlight coming into the planet, maybe only about 1% of it is actually absorbed by plants and then used to, of course, from there, fuel the rest of all the food chains and food webs on the planet. And that's really kind of a humbling thought when you think about it. I mean, of all the life on the planet, it only takes 1% of the sunlight coming in to fuel all of that life. Think about how much more productivity would be out there if we could actually capture more of that sunlight, harness more of the sunlight. If plants could do that, how much more food would be available for, say, animals. It's a really kind of amazing thought to think about how much sunlight is actually not absorbed by plants and therefore converted into the bodies of animals and fungi and so forth. So of that 1% coming in, roughly 3% of that is used. When I say 1% of the energy is available for photosynthesis, what I mean there is the sunlight coming in, roughly only 1% of that is actually usable by the plants. of that, only 3% actually gets absorbed. The rest of it is bounced off or lost as heat or that kind of a thing. So 3% of 1% is what actually fuels the life on the planet. And so from there, we have this concept of net primary productivity, which is, we've alluded to this before, but it's the amount of plant biomass, because it is primary productivity. It's the amount of producer biomass produced per unit area per unit of time. So if you're looking at 100 kilograms of plant matter per hectare per year, that would be a measure of plant productivity, net primary productivity. Of course, the things we saw in previous sections on the biomes play a role here. So the amount of precipitation the plants get, the temperature, the amount of CO2 in the air, all of those things will affect productivity and make it go up or go down depending on the conditions. So we've looked at some of these biomes already based on things like rainfall and temperature. We've seen tropical rainforests that are very lush and productive and very diverse. Estuaries are kind of the same way. Coral reefs are right up there, somewhere between these two in some sense. Temperate deciduous forests, we actually live in a fairly diverse biome ourselves. And then from there, you start dropping off pretty quickly. Coniferous forests and grasslands and so forth are much less productive for the most part, because they get less precipitation and or, in the case of this one and this one over here, they're also colder. We see the idea of trophic levels. Now, a trophic level is like a step in the food chain. It's like a link in the food chain. So starting off with producers. Producers are the things that actually capture sunlight, and from there convert it into carbohydrates, which are available for the rest of the organisms of the planet. That's the first trophic level. That's the base of the food chain. So we take producers, and then we can start feeding those to things like herbivores. So herbivores are things that feed on the producers. They don't have to be plants. They could also be algae or even blue-green bacteria for that matter. They could be herbivores feeding on those things. We could have carnivores, which consume the herbivores typically. And so you've got the first example, herbivores would be deer. For carnivores, the example would be a wolf that eats the deer, right? Omnivores are things that feed on more than one trophic level. So if you have something like a bear that eats not only occasional animal matter, like fish especially, but also nuts and berries and those kinds of things, grubs, they're feeding on all kinds of trophic levels. So they would actually be classified as an omnivore. And humans are omnivores for that matter as well. There are scavengers that feed on dead things, and when I say feed on dead things, these are not the things that break up or decompose into really tiny components. These are kind of the organisms that take the first pass at an organism once it dies. So a crow or a turkey vulture feeding on a carcass, those would be examples of scavengers. From there, we can go into the realm of detritivores, and detritus just simply means dead stuff that's already been partially broken down. These would be things that feed on the smaller bits of dead material once they've been broken down by the scavengers. And then you could even go one level below that and look at the decomposers, which feed on every level above that. Those would be things like bacteria and fungi especially, that really take those dead bits of animal and plant matter and so forth and break them up into the smallest of components, nutrients in fact, that can be used by other things in that food chain or in the food web. Right, so think about trophic levels as we go through these first few steps here. They are the different levels, like a producer or an herbivore or a carnivore or a decomposer. Detritivores, again, are things that feed on dead materials. They don't break them up into the smallest components, but they're kind of somewhere in between. So things that feed on dead leaf litter or a rotting log, things like what you might call a roly-poly here, or a sow bug or a potato bug. Actually, it's not a bug at all. It's actually a crustacean. But still, it's a detritus feeding type organism. So if you break open a rotting log or move aside some leaf litter, you might very well see some pill bugs underneath beginning to break down that material. So when the roly-poly is done doing its job, obviously it's going to produce excrement. It's going to produce its own waste. And that waste then represents a partially broken down version of the organism that it consumes. So when the log is broken down by the isopod, the excrement from the isopod represents nutrients which can be used in a more kind of fundamental form by, say, a plant. It's not the fully decomposed state, but it's pretty close to it, right? So the detritivores are going to eventually break things down even further, and then from there it's on to the decomposers, which are microorganisms, typically bacteria or sometimes fungi, that return the materials back into the ecosystem in the most broken down form possible. And so those would be, again, decomposers, microbial things. They take the nutrients they need, and whatever nutrients are left, the nutrients they can't digest, the nutrients they can't absorb, those are then passed on to the rest of the ecosystem, so they can be used by other organisms. So these guys are especially important. They're the ones that free up nutrients that have existed in the body of a dead organism for a while and makes those nutrients available again. You can't typically have a plant feeding on a dead animal, right? It's not going to work. The nutrients in the dead animal are not available to the plant, so they have to be converted first into some more readily available form for the plant to be able to use them. So again, these two levels here, detritivores and decomposers, very important in the recycling aspect. They tend to be ones that don't get as much of the attention, or they're not as glamorous, right? We don't think about studying ecosystems and looking at fungi and bacteria. Typically, most people don't do that at the top of their head. They want to think about predators, and they want to think about carnivores and big, exciting, flashy things. But without these decaying type organisms, the ones that do that job, there would be none of the other levels in the food chain, because the plants would die off due to lack of nutrients. And of course, if there's no plants, then all the other links are not going to exist either. So they're very, very important in maintaining primary productivity and making sure there's nutrients available for the rest of the biological community. We take a look again at this trophic structure that we talked about. We've got primary producers here, again, photosynthetic plants, algae, bacteria, blue-green bacteria, which are then fed to primary consumers like the herbivores, which then feed material to the carnivores or secondary consumers, and then finally on to some top level. There may, in some really elaborate food webs, be a fifth level, but beyond that, there's not going to be enough energy in the system to support much more than a fifth level. The key to this is that every time you convert from, say, level 1 to level 2, or 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, every jump that you take, you're losing like 90% of the energy that was present in that previous level, and you're only passing on roughly 10% of the energy that existed in the previous level. So if we're starting down here, we're losing, 10 times, 100 times, we're losing 1,000 times the biomass relative up here to what we had down here. And so going beyond that, it's simply not going to be possible. Again, the things that feed at all the trophic levels would be things like parasites, potentially, omnivores at times, scavengers, decomposers, detritivores. They're going to be the other ones that are feeding on all of these other organisms once they've died. Again, the idea of a food web here. We've got a primary producer here, phytoplankton, that we've talked about before. We then have zooplankton, which are more animal-like floating organisms, which are then fed to small fishes. These are planktivorous fishes, which can then be fed on to, say, some fourth-level tertiary consumer like a shark. So that would be like an aquatic food web or food chain. On land, kind of the same idea. We have a first trophic level, which is the plant. We have a second trophic level, which is a caterpillar feeding on the plant. We have a third trophic level, which is a bird feeding on the caterpillar. And then a fourth trophic level, which is something like a kestrel or a merlin or a falcon that's feeding on the smaller birds. That would be the top predator in that terrestrial food chain. Okay, so again, this transfer of energy is by no means 100%, and at best, really, it's only about 10%. Usually it's even a little bit less than that. So again, when we convert from one form to another, some of the energy is given off as heat. And you can only make so many transfers before almost all the energy is being converted to heat, and there's really nothing left to feed to a next level in a food chain. So at that point, it's sort of the end of the road when it comes to links in the food chain. There's also indigestible material, so whenever one organism feeds on another one, it's not like 100% of the material can be passed on. There will be bits of energy left over that were not accessible that will then go into the part of the food chain occupied by the decomposers and detritivores. So again, we're not dealing with 100% transfer efficiency. Even within a link in the food chain, before something gets consumed, if a caterpillar is feeding on a plant, it's using some of the energy it's fed upon to maintain its own body. It's using energy to grow. It's maintaining energy to repair itself. It's perhaps getting ready to go into pupation and become become a butterfly or a moth. And so by the time the bird eats the caterpillar has already burned up a lot of the energy it got from the plant, and there's simply not going to be that much left to transfer into that next level in the food chain. And of course, some organisms never get eaten either, and so they're going to go straight into the realm of the detritivores and decomposers while not being consumed by anybody else. The idea of an ecological pyramid or a food pyramid sort of arranges things based on the level of the food chain and how much energy might be present in the level of the food chain. So typically what has to happen here is there have to be many, many more producers than consumers. You can't usually have more consumers than producers, because if you did, there wouldn't be enough food for them, and they would cease to exist as a result. The base of the food chain always has to be bigger than the top of the food chain. There has to be enough food in one level to support the next level. And if that's not the case, if there's some sort of upset or temporary imbalance in that, such that there are more consumers than producers, that's not going to be a very sustainable type situation, and typically that's going to result in the collapse of a food pyramid. Again, the second law of thermodynamics, we got to make sure we understand that. Energy is given off as heat every time we transfer from one form to the next. Predator efficiency is much less than 100%. At best, we typically deal with 10% because that makes the numbers easy, but in reality, transfer efficiency might be on the order of only 6 or 7% efficient when it comes down to how much the predator actually gets from the animal that it eats. So we talk about the 10% rule. As an example, if you were to take 100 kilograms of clover, which is about 220 pounds, that would be enough clover to support about 10 kilograms of rabbit that's feeding on clover. So we're 10% left over, 90% lost from clover to rabbit. If we were to feed the rabbits then to a predator like a fox, that initially 100 kilograms of clover would be enough to support only 1 kilogram of fox biomass, and that's going to be like less than a fox. So you can imagine if you have a whole population, dozens or hundreds of foxes, you think about how much plant biomass it takes to support that much predator biomass. Much less if you were to add a fourth level to the food chain, something that feeds on the foxes, how much energy you would actually need to do that. It's a huge amount of initial energy to make that happen. So classically, people talked about food chains where you had a single producer, a single primary consumer, a single secondary consumer, a single tertiary consumer in terms of number of species. But what we find out as we look more and more at nature and how it really works, it's not so much a food chain as it is a food web. Right? So if we take a look here, for example, at this mouse is feeding on plant biomass. But there are multiple things that could feed on the mouse. We could have a badger, we could have an owl, we could have some other predatory organism like a snake feeding on the mouse. So it's multiple things feeding on this one level. Same thing with a rabbit. Same thing with the plants for that matter. Right? So there's a huge web of interconnectedness in nature when it comes to who feeds on whom, where energy goes, how many levels are in the food chain. There's really a lot of interconnectedness to this. Even within a trophic level, if you're looking at the mouse and the rabbit and the bison and these guys back here, they may all be competing for the same food resource, right? They're all feeding for the same crop or the same plant. So there's going to be competition even within a level. And then you've got these multiple levels where you're experiencing herbivory and predation and parasitism and those kinds of things. It's a very much tightly woven, almost web of trophic interactions happening here. Kind of illustrating again the idea of energy transfer, we have primary producers, which are these plants, that could be fed to various herbivores, so rabbits and grasshoppers and butterflies and so forth. But it turns out this primary producer plant biomass, only some of it actually gets consumed. Right? These guys aren't going to eat every last little bit of plant matter out there because plants can defend themselves and they're going to keep themselves from being completely consumed. So some of the plant matter is not consumed and it goes directly into the decomposer community, goes into the sediments, and it's sort of lost temporarily at least from the living part of the food web. That material that is consumed, some of it's digestible, the rest of it's not. So cellulose, for example, would not be digestible. So when these organisms produce their excrement, it's going to contain undigested plant matter, which goes again into the decomposer community and also the sediments. Of the material that is consumed and digested, some of it goes to fuel the growth of the primary consumers. Some of it goes into fueling metabolic aerobic respiration of the primary consumers, and some of it is lost as heat. Right? So again, once we go to the next step, we take our primary consumers and feed those to secondary consumers. Again, not all the primary consumers are going to be eaten. There's going to be butterflies and caterpillars and bunny rabbits that don't get eaten. They, again, when they die of other causes aside from being eaten, are going to go into the part of the food web that comprises decomposers and sediments and so forth. The part of the animals that are not digested, so the fur and parts of the bones and so forth, those are not digestible. Those go into the decomposer community. And that little bit of the herbivore over here that is digested is going to fuel body growth of secondary consumers, respiration of secondary consumers, and also some of it's going to be lost as heat again. So you can imagine if you add one or two more levels of this food web, how much energy that's actually going to be left. It's going to be a tiny, tiny little fraction of what we started with by the time we get out to maybe a fourth or fifth level in the food chain. Again, we take an example with some numbers on it. If you have 1.3, say, kilograms of plants, that's going to be enough to feed Actually, this is numbers of plants, not mass in this case. If you have 1,500,000 plants, that's roughly enough to feed about 200,000 herbivores, mice, caterpillar kinds of things, total herbivores. Those 200,000 herbivores are going to feed roughly 90,000 carnivores. So the caterpillars that are eaten by the spider, the mice that are eaten by the kestrel, is going to be enough to feed maybe one top carnivore. In this case, a fox, which may not even arguably be the top of the food chain, but still pretty far up there. It's a fourth level, so the amount of biomass for the top level is going to be relatively small compared to how much was down here in the bottom. So it's going to take 1.5 million plants to support one fox, is what that comes down to, which is a really staggering thought when you think about the how much energy it takes to support something like a top predator. Like a wolf or something is going to use a huge amount of energy. All right, so just another example of a food web, but also energy transfer and then again heat loss as well. Up here, all of these are losing energy as heat all the time. So again, when we look at a food pyramid or a food web, this energy transfer component has a bunch of really important kinds of consequences. Again, the plants are going to be the ones that are the most dominant in terms of numbers and biomass. From there, it's on to the herbivores and carnivores. Decomposers typically are right up there as well because they have access to all the levels in the food chain. It's not just one level, they're feeding on every level, so they're going to have a large biomass as well. One other consequence of this is if we look at the human diet in terms of concern over how much food may or may not be present on the planet, when we feed food to, say, a cow and then feed on the cow, what we've done is we've lost like 90% of the calories that were present in the initial amount of food. So in other words, if we were to feed more like an herbivore as opposed to a carnivore, there could actually be the potential to support more people on the planet, which may not be a good thing, arguably, but it would certainly alleviate some hunger. If more people chose to feed on plant matter than animal matter, there would be more energy available for everybody to use. Because when you feed the plant to the cow, there's a 90% loss of energy, and then when you feed the cow to the human, there's another 90% loss of energy. So you're reducing energy components twice by 90% when you go through animals as a step in the human food chain. If we were just to go directly from grain to humans, there'd be a much larger quantity of food available to feed those humans. All right, so from there we're going to go to nutrients, and I'm going to kind of stop here, and I will start up another section here momentarily.